So the question is, how can farmers and other farm businesses secure their livelihoods and build resilience for their businesses and for Wales as a whole? And so we want to just explore some of those themes this morning with the panel. So what I would like to do is just to start off with, is just to ask each of the members of the panel their initial thoughts on that in terms of how do they see them securing their businesses, and what are their thoughts around how we can build more resilience within businesses, both their businesses and for businesses throughout Wales. So if I could start with Chris, is that possible? Chris? You're on, that's it.
Yes, yeah, great, thanks very much. Well, I'm the odd one out here. I'm not a farmer. I've come to this from a decade working in the renewable energy, the small scale community renewable energy sector. And I suppose, and I'll go into this in more detail as if we get the chance today. I see an analogy with what happened in the renewable energy sector and what could happen in the food sector, where the government in the energy sector put in a production subsidy to bring about a 10-year transformation in renewables. We went from 6% renewables in electricity to 37% in a decade. It was an enormous stimulus and investment in new production methods. And I'm just wondering whether we couldn't do something similar in the food industry by subsidizing production of food for local consumption. And it all comes down to the trilemma which we faced in the energy industry of cheap energy, sustainable, reliable supply of energy, and green energy, which was introduced. And actually the same trilemma, I think, exists in the food sector. The need for cheap food, which has been always the focus for hundreds of years, cheap food, sustainability of supply, so more production and less reliance on imports, but also introducing into that trilemma the third element of sustainable, economically and socially sustainable food production.
Great, thank you, Chris. Emily, what are your thoughts and how do you see things developing? You're on mute, Emily, sorry.
Mute. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can, yes.
Brilliant. This is a massive topic, isn't it? I mean, This is like, let's sort out the world in one fell swoop. So the way I see it is that I think we've all come to the realization that a sort of top-down plan is not going to make any sustainable solution. And I think we've got to break it down really to the level of our communities, not individuals, that's too small, but community level, globally. You know, so we're looking at Wales now, and I don't think we can all save the world, but I think if we can work on our little patch to work within natural law and work within a framework that benefits all sort of levels of our community, then that's the sort of overall colour to work with. I think I'm coming from a medical background, you know, 3 generations of doctors, veterinary training, looking at our health as well as our food production, and that really fascinates me because I think for farming to be sustainable, it needs to be hooked into lots of different levels. So it needs to be hooked into education, health, ecology, everything. It's not, we've gone past the sort of reductionist stage. You know, things don't exist as single elements in our society. We've gone right to one end of that parabola, and I think we need to start really swinging back to reshaping our whole language about everything, you know, rather than suppression, elimination, combat. We need to start thinking about the farm as I think farmers are already doing this and always have, but an interconnected organism, and from there the farm goes out and connects to other levels of society. This is a bit wishy-washy, but I think we just have to see ourselves as connected in so many ways to different layers, and that in itself will make it sustainable, because we're not an entity on our own. So with our example is we're starting out producing quality low input wheat now and milling on farm. We've actually got a mill arriving this week, so we're not quite building a mill. We've bought a stone mill, and it's just one aspect of the farm, but I can't see how the farm's going to be 10 years down the line. So I'm working on an aspect that feels really good, and it works with the soil well, and it works with our cattle because they play into that, and it works with the tree planting that Keith's doing. So it's starting from one thing which feels really right and really in balance, and letting that emanate out. And I think as farmers, if we are working with the right ideas and following natural law, then I don't think you can go far wrong. I'm not an expert on subsidies and things like that, but I think subsidies would help. But I think we just have to get the core of our understanding of how we work with the soils and with the rest of our local society right, and it'll go from there. The picture's too big to see 10 years down the line. But for me, it's starting off from the right place. So that's what I got to say so far. It's very weird speaking to myself.
No, it's fine. It's good. Thank you, Emily. Yeah, I appreciate that. It is a little bit weird, isn't it, when you're not getting the feedback?
No, it's
the same with you in the room. So no, that's fine. I mean, I think there's some themes there coming out from what Chris is saying and Emily is saying around community. So we can explore some of those thoughts, but let's just move on to Holly now and just see what Holly's thoughts are.
Thank you. Yes, so actually, like Chris, I have to confess I'm not myself a farmer. I am part of a cooperative veg farm, and I support the farm by doing the accounts, the customer communications. I can't take credit for the delicious vegetables that the growers here produce, but taking off on Em's point about community, so we're a community supported agriculture vegetable farm, and we run a farm shop and a veg scheme that we have around 150 families on, and we're an organic farm, so we use 7-year crop rotation and a huge variety of crops to ensure biodiversity. Now I'm also here primarily as the policy and campaigns coordinator for Landworks Alliance Cymru, and Landworks Alliance is a union of small-scale sustainable farms. So our farm, Undeb, is one of those, but we represent around 100, around 170 members across Wales. And the things that our members have in common is that we focus on agroecological techniques, so the techniques that work with nature, and short supply chains, and we campaign for a food system that benefits everyone. So this question of silos, I think is a really important one, because it's, in terms of the conversation and often the policy focus, it's often, it does seem to be very much in silos. So with the Welsh government's post-Brexit plans, a lot of what's in there was really welcomed by our members, because many of them don't qualify for the current subsidies, they're too small. So they don't meet the 5-hectare limit, despite being very viable, productive businesses. But they may qualify for some of the subsidies that are based on improving environmental benefits. But there was nothing about there's no real focus on food, and particularly no focus on nutritional health. And at the same time, there was a food consultation that came out, and it didn't really focus on farming. So there does seem to be this real silo in policy making. And I think that, hopefully talk a bit more about some of the work that we're doing, both as a Landworks Alliance and in coalition with other organisations, to try and bring this more holistic approach. But just a couple of things in terms of resilience, I think it's really important to point out. In the face of Brexit, obviously this is going to be a huge, it's a huge change both in the subsidies and the access to markets. And one of the things about farms that focus on direct sales, shorter supply chains, is that we're actually a lot less vulnerable to Brexit. So we're concerned about the overall impact it's going to have on the rural economy, and obviously, who knows what else in the country. But for our business specifically, we're not that vulnerable because our customers live within mostly within a 10-mile radius. So we're not worried about being able to sell. Now, there's obviously some things like when we do import a small number of veg throughout the year to top up our veg scheme. So it's not that it won't affect us, but we are in a much better place. And and that will be similar for a lot of members. So we have got that built-in resilience, and we also saw that resilience in response to the coronavirus pandemic, where a lot of the Land Workers Alliance members were able to very quickly shift their business model and to ensure they could support their local communities. So if they weren't already supplying directly to customers, because of the scale, they were able to do that. So I think focusing on ecologically sustainable methods and short supply chains from the farm level, and then from the policy level, having policies that really enable that will be crucial.
Sorry, lovely. Thank you, Holly. I had myself on mute again. So, yeah, brilliant. Thank you. We'll come back to some of those themes. As you say, I'm sure there's some learnings we can get from LWA. So we'll go back and explore some of those in a moment. I'll just bring in our last member of our panel, Dafydd Morris-Jones. Dafydd, what are your initial thoughts on this huge, as Emily indicated, huge issue that we're trying to address in an hour and a quarter?
Yeah, thank you, Roger. I'm gonna switch to Welsh for my introduction. If anyone has trouble, please flag it in the dialogue box. I'll switch back to English again. But I feel more comfortable expressing my first thoughts in Welsh, and then I'll answer any other questions in English or Welsh as they come. Be dwi'n teimlo yn bersonol
what I personally feel is that some of the most resilient systems that we have in Wales, examples of agriculture that have existed for centuries is highland farming. Now, the stock that we have is in itself resilient stock. Exists without any inputs. The livestock that we rear is livestock that in itself can create systems that are entirely sustainable, and then this cascades to the rest of the industry. What I feel, to me, what is the heart of creating a resilient and sustainable system that is mindful of the need to get to grips with the crisis in our ecology? Is the need to unlock the highland. I think the highland has been locked up for far too long, and this is putting detrimental pressure on our lowland that can truly produce in a more flexible and effective manner. If we can take the pressure away and use our highlands as we used to do. As somebody who farms on the hills, I have seen agriculture dwindling from the highlands over the past 30 years, and this has been very detrimental to our highland systems, but also to our lowland systems. And I think that in order to enable this, we need to ensure that we have supply chains that are short, that can truly enable us to sell our stock, but that we have those traditional links between lowland and highland. Breed stock in the highlands that are finished off in the lowlands, and then to move stock much more flexibly.
Just fel bod gennon ni'r gallu na i fel pressure yr isfawr ac i ddefnyddio'r ucheldir yn wirioneddol. Mwyn alluogi hynny, mae rhaid i ni sicrhau bod ni ddim yn peryglu am edrycheldir. A un o'r pethau wirioneddol yn becso amdano gyda polisïau cyfredol yw yn bod ni'n dechrau edrych ar gynlluniau taliadau sy'n talu am anweithgarwch a sy'n talu I ni bido ffarmo. Neu sy'n talu yn hytrach am ddefnydd tir
paying for inactive land use. Elaborate on this, but I think this is driving us towards a pattern where we are intensifying our non-LFA farming. Now, LFA land is 80% of Welsh land, and as a result, we're doing nothing, but we're just trying to squeeze out every ounce of production from our land that can't take on any more pressure. It's been under too much pressure over the last half century. So I think there are so many lessons to learn from traditional highland systems, and in broadening this pattern and extending it to other areas and to use the highlands as we have in the past. I'll finish there. I'd like to elaborate on this as our discussions progress, if that is okay.
That's great. Thank you, Dafydd. Yeah, some interesting thoughts there around land use, particularly, which I think we can certainly explore. Given the topography of Wales, I think it's a really important issue and something that we should seriously be considering. So some interesting thoughts there, really, and some common themes. I think everyone touched on the point of local networks and building local networks. And what would appear to me is there are lots of people that are doing lots of things on a individual basis, but somehow we need to try and bring that into a broader policy arrangement, and also encourage this local networking. So I think that's something that I would like to ask people about, how they feel we can take that next step. I think the other thing that I think we need to be considering potentially, and I'd again be interested in the panel's thoughts, is given the population of Wales and given the amount of agricultural production in Wales, then the Welsh population isn't going to be able to absorb all the produce that Wales produces. So I wonder how people feel about that, and how do we manage to find that balance, because obviously there's going to need to be some product moved out of Wales, I would suggest. And there are requirements for the Welsh population from farms within England, certainly. And animal feeds is one of them, although Dafydd did indicate, that a lot of his production comes from forage alone. So I wonder whether I could just ask people to give us their thoughts in terms of how they feel we can move forward in terms of that, building those local networks, and how do we start to engage government and the farming community as a whole in terms of how we move that forward. So if I could go, I'll go to Emily first, if that's all right, just see what Emily's thoughts are. I'm just conscious that Chris is not a farmer, so I thought I'll start with Emily just to be sorry, Emily, to throw this one at you, but yeah, you're on mute, I'm afraid, again, so you're on mute, Emily.
Now I'm off mute.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yes.
Sorry, Stephen shut me up because I'm in a cafe in byd-eang at the minute. So we've got a bit of background noise going on. So there was a couple of points there, weren't there, Roger? So in terms of exporting from Wales, obviously, overall we're going to produce more food than the Welsh population needs. I mean, I don't like the idea of set borders. And I grew up in Hereford, so I'm from the other side. So, but the way I see it is these borders have been fluid for eons, and actually the marches in itself, even though a lot of it is in England, well, it is in England now, it has been in Wales, and I don't think we'll actually need to go very far to distribute this great produce. For example, I'll give you one of my examples is that the flour that I'm producing this season, half of it will go to Hereford because it's my hometown, and that is a large, As soon as you're getting into England, the urban population is immediately bigger. So there's a lot of mouths to feed. So I would say it's a step-by-step thing. I'd say in terms of carbon footprint, we need to make sure we're not shifting food too far. And it's a case of seeing how far we need to go to distribute the Welsh produce. That's as much as I've thought on that subject, actually. I hadn't considered it a lot yet. In terms of policy change and making connections between people, farmers, working on community level, I think each of us is going to have a unique situation, but we will have information to share. So I would say that it's the communication and knowledge sharing that's going to be really important. So events like this, hopefully in person, because this is missing out 90% of the great human-to-human sharing. But, you know, sharing information is going to be key. And for me, just picking up on what Dafydd said then, the uplands absolutely are being underused. I mean, it depends what you're calling upland, whether you're calling the really top of the hill uplands, or whether you're just talking about the slopes. From what I understand about the history of farming in this country, and actually even looking at the Middle East and the origins of agriculture there, the slopes were the original places where corn was grown, where all sorts of crops were grown. And we've got obsessed with this idea that all the arable stuff should be grown on the flat plains of Herefordshire and Somerset, and not so, I don't think. You just have to pick the right crops that will do well in these sort of unique, specific areas. And I think information sharing like that, like saying, have you thought about growing this crop on your farm? It's a great crop. I can show you how it works for me. So these slopes of the Welsh Hills are more productive than we think, as long as we pick the right things to grow on them, animals or crops, and share that information. So I'll shut up there. I think that otherwise I'll go on forever, but that's my thoughts.
That's great. Thank you, Emily. Can I just go back to Dafydd next then, and just get his thoughts in terms of how do we build, he talked about building local networks and you know, local supply. I noticed on a couple of chats there's reference to local procurement with the NHS, and also the tourism trade. Obviously there's a large influx of people, not necessarily at the moment, but one would hope next year anyway there'll be people coming back to visit Wales again. So is there opportunities there? But Dafydd, what are your thoughts around building these local networks that we've talked about, and how do we encourage that local sourcing?
A couple of things came to mind. I'll answer this in English because the rest of the conversation is in English, so I'm thinking in that language. Firstly, we've got networks that work nationally, UK nationally, which are already quite local. The one that springs to mind to me is the mutton trade. The mutton trade is predominantly a domestic market, UK domestic. So you only have to look just outside the borders of Wales. If you look towards Birmingham in particular as a market, Liverpool, Manchester, the north of England, the mutton trade is one that goes all year round, has a relatively stable price attached to it, and the destination for that product really isn't that far from where it's grown, which is actually quite different to Welsh lamb. So there are already processes and supply chains in place for one of our major products, which ends up mainly in cities not that far away to my east at the moment. So building on those supply chains that already exist is important. I think there's a massive role for legislation. You know, you've only got to go to France and go into a Leclerc or a Carrefour or a Super U and realise that the first 4 aisles you walk along are of local produce. That doesn't happen by accident. That happens because there's legislation that demands it. And it's based on the footprint of your supermarket. It's based on how much area you give to local produce in comparison to produce from further away. And it's even more stringent in France when you come to wines. You know, you try and find a Chilean wine in a French supermarket. There's about 3 bottles as compared to 2 aisles of French wine. So I think there's a massive role for legislation in terms of starting to force our our larger supply chains to look more locally. And we've only got to look into Europe and just across the channel to see exactly how they're doing that. The other thing that came to mind as far as sort of I was thinking of building local networks, back to this idea of transhumance again and of livestock movement. And I liked what you were saying, Em, about the slopes being used for crops. I think we need to think about crop destination. I think traditionally, if we look at Wales's cropland, it was more extensive than it is now. But 1 year out of every 3, it had to end up in livestock because you just didn't have the climatic conditions that allowed you to either harvest it when it was ripe or harvest it when it was able to be dried. So you need to have a diversified destination as well as a diversified portfolio of production, which means that you need those supply chains to be very short, and you need to link up individual farms within an area where you can transfer fodder and transfer stock as well, up and down country. I think it's about that flexibility of movement and recognizing that not every year is going to stick to the same pattern. As we shift towards a changing climate where sort of climate variability is going to be more of an issue in the UK than necessarily full-scale climate Armageddon, we need to have systems that are able to cope and absorb with that variability far more, and that will involve moving stuff. You know, be that planting fields for 1 year, not planting them for the next, or be that moving livestock significantly in 1 year and leaving them in fallow land on the other. So I'll stop there, but I think, yeah, we need to be looking systemically as the UK in terms of our export and import, but we also need to look at individual farm systems and how we can expand on things like overwintering, tack animals. We send our animals down country over winter. All we're looking at now, realistically, is the return of those animals up country in the summer, which is something that only disappeared in about 1975. It's just reconnecting with systems that aren't that old. And I think that would be a fantastic start.
Excellent, thank you. We have Dave Morris on the conference from the Welsh Government. So I was going to just ask for Holly's thoughts on this as well, and then go to Chris. And then I was going to ask Dave whether he would be prepared to give us some thoughts from Welsh Government as to some of these themes that we're exploring at the moment around supply chain legislation, around supermarkets, etc. So let's first go to Holly and see what Holly's thoughts are on how we build these local networks and encourage local consumption of local food.
Thanks. Yeah, so the key thing is having the infrastructure in place. So there's, for having processing, cleaning, processing places in regional centres, and also things like local butchers and slaughterhouses. So I know there's a very good one in Llanllwch, but a lot of places have to transfer their animals very far away. So it's much harder to have those local supply chains if you don't have the infrastructure to do it. And then there's a huge role for public procurement, which seems to be very underused. And I think lessons could be learned from what they did in Preston, where they really focused on using, it wasn't not specifically for food, but in general, using anchor institutions like universities and other public sector places to prioritize local supply. But without the processing places, it would be very challenging. Like, we couldn't supply a local hospital, for example, much as we would like to, because we don't have the commercial kitchen to get our vegetables into the condition that, cleaned and chopped as the hospital would like it. But if something like that were available easier, that would be one step. But on this question of how much food and Wales produces, I think it's important to look at different sectors, because Wales is in terms of horticulture, Wales produces very little. About 0.1% of Welsh land is used for growing fruit and vegetables, and there is about, I think Toby Cymru estimated about 100 commercial edible horticulture, which is I really think Wales could do better. And there's often an assumption that we can't grow vegetables in Wales, but we just need 2% of Welsh land to produce 5 a day for the equivalent of the Welsh population. So that doesn't mean we can't import vegetables at all. There's going to be some that we don't grow here, but the fact that actually there is a huge potential, and that's bearing in mind around 7% of Welsh land is grade 1 to 3A, and here in Tyddyn Teg we're growing on grade 3B. So actually, there is enough land, but what it needs is more investment and more prioritization. There's sort of been this, partly because the subsidies prioritize large land ownership and horticulture is smaller, but also in terms of the capital equipment that you can get from some of the grants from Welsh Government, prioritize the capital goods that are needed for livestock farming. And there aren't grants for things like polytunnels, and so there needs to be just that prioritization on the capital investment. And just a quick anecdote to really highlight this point. We had a German TV show come and visit us a few weeks ago, and they're a food program. They focus on sort of regional food cultures, and they really wanted to find. They were doing a feature about Snowdonia and North Wales broader. And they really wanted to find some leeks, and they'd really struggled. So they just wanted a shot of some leeks in the ground. And they were so happy when they got to us because they had really struggled to find any leeks. And so they, wow, that's the national vegetable, and they couldn't find anywhere to shoot. And it's not that there are other veg farms around that are growing leeks, but the fact that it was so difficult was quite telling.
Great, yes, rather ironic in a way that you can't source leeks in Wales. I'm going to move to Chris now, and there's been a few comments on the chat while we've been talking, and some of the discussion has been around agroforestry, tree planting, and the like, and I think there is this competition, you could call it, or I don't know why it's not really a competition, but the issue around trying to plant trees, but also sustain upland and lowland farming systems. So, Chris, I wonder whether you have any thoughts on that particularly, but also any thoughts around this local supply chain food network thing.
Okay. On the local supply chain, I think everything people are talking about is great. Information sharing, knowledge sharing, that's great. My point is that you're not going to change it unless you change the economics. You're not going to change the system, and that is absolutely fundamental. I'll give you an anecdote. For 10 years I've been a volunteer at Talgarth Mill. It's a restored water mill. It was restored with lottery funding, so the capital costs us nothing. We don't pay rent for it. We've got volunteer labour. The grain we buy to mill costs about the same per kilogram as Sainsbury's sell stone ground flour. So you can buy stone ground flour for 70-75 pence a kilo. We're buying the grain at 60-70 pence a kilo. The economics of large scale production mean that local food is so often it's exclusive for the middle classes and for the affluent. It isn't going to change our mass consumption. It's too broad, and unless you address the economics of production and scale of production, all of this is good intentions and is going to make very little difference to the large scale. It'll make a difference around the edges, but you won't address the key issues. And with the subsidy regime changing, with the Brexit coming up, there is a fear, I have a real fear, that what we'll do is we will, in a large extent, we'll move towards more carbon intensive, more capital intensive, and more chemical intensive farming is a way of getting production down. It's very difficult for us to compete with with countries where land is cheap, where labour is cheap, where ecological regulation is lower. And it's going to be very, very difficult. And we're going to have to address, if we don't address those issues, we will get absolutely nowhere. And so I think it's a very, it's a very big, you've got to address the production costs, which my analogy, which I introduced at the beginning, is that they did this in the energy sector. Small scale renewable energy is more expensive than a massive offshore wind farm or an upland wind farm. But by subsidizing production for a fixed 10-year period, it triggered in what Holly is looking for, which is massive investment. Massive private investment came in because the economics were changed, because the subsidy was changed. And I really worry that the subsidy regime, I'm not against payments for ecosystem services, they're important, but they don't address the economics of production. And unless we do that, I don't think we'll get the changes in production method or the short supply chains, because ours is going to be cheaper. Flying it in from Spain, flying it in from Kenya for reasons. And you've got to look at the consolidation and the control that big corporations have over the global food system. These are really big opponents. These are very, very challenging competitors to work with.
Excellent. Some very good points there, Chris. As I mentioned, Dave Morris is with us from the Welsh Government. It seems to me that there's a feeling here that I think Holly alluded to, where there was a paper that came out from Welsh Government around farming, and there was another around food and health, but there was no interconnection there. And it feels to me that the conversations that we've been having so far have been around how we support and build these local networks. So that's encouraging local procurement from universities and through the National Health, etc., etc. But that can only be achieved if we've got the infrastructure in place in the first place that allows us to be able to develop local food systems and local food networks. So, the point about local abattoirs, local processing, and also, again, Holly talked about the horticultural element, about the fact that there's such a small amount of horticulture in Wales. So again, there are areas within the Welsh farming systems which would need some encouragement. And Chris's point about the economics of it, that to get these sort of networks going, to build this local food networks, then we're going to need some support from government to be able to build the networks and to get them to a point where they can sustain themselves in their own right. So I don't know, David, whether you're in a position to be able to comment on one of those things. I would be interested in your thoughts.
Good morning, Roger. Good morning, everyone. And yeah, thank you. I'm more than happy to comment. And it's a very interesting discussion and some very useful points made. I suppose the big question is, why has Welsh agriculture developed in the way it has? And why is Welsh agriculture dominated by beef and sheep and dairy production? And why is there so little horticulture? It was never part of a grand plan. It happened originally and largely because I suppose that was the type of farming that was most suited to the landscape, the soils, the climate, the topography. So, people do what works best with the constraints that they're faced with. And then, of course, we had the advent of the subsidy systems largely from the 60s, 70s onwards, which encouraged that type of production. There's no doubt that the old headage payment regime, followed by area payments, has encouraged people to do more of the same. And it's also enabled less efficient systems to coexist alongside more efficient systems, because subsidies has, in a sense, bailed people out when it comes to being able to make a living from what they're doing. And that hasn't encouraged the level of diversification that we've talked about, such as horticulture has been mentioned. Wales is a very, very small horticultural sector. We would like to see that grow. We're doing things to encourage that. We support Tyfu Cymru, Tyfu Bunny. We have a horticultural business cluster. We have a huge amount of community growing initiatives across Wales. And there's also the First Minister himself has said he wants to double the number of allotments and the rest. So the small scale in particular, there's a lot happening, but also on the larger scale. But it's never going to be a major agricultural sector in Wales. And if I take, for example, I live in Mid Wales, I'm surrounded by predominantly beef and sheep farmers. And if I ask them why they won't consider horticultural production, there's lots of reasons. Some of it is, well, it's not a sector we really know and understand, so we haven't perhaps got the skills and knowledge we need. We haven't got confidence maybe in the marketplace. And we know that over very many years, the supermarkets being the main outlet for produce from farms in Wales, and they're very, very discerning when it comes to horticultural crops. They want certain level of production, certain quality, size, shape, weights, everything else, and everything else is unacceptable. And that has killed an awful lot of horticultural production. And there's also the investment needed. And people have quite rightly said, well, if we want to encourage a new sector, we need to provide maybe some incentive to do that, whether it's grants or subsidies or whatever else. But it's a very, very big challenge to persuade our agricultural industry to change to a significant degree to other enterprises such as horticulture. We do need more supply chain integration, and that's something we're working on. The strategies, the food strategy consultation, which was issued last year, it happened then because it had to happen then because our existing food strategy stroke action plan was about to finish, and we needed to have some clarity on where to go next. In an ideal world, an agriculture strategy perhaps would have been consulted on first, or we would have had one holistic consultation. But because of the much more significant changes to subsidies and CAP post-EU, and the need to look again at how we support farming and land management, the sustainable farming on our land was a huge, huge piece of policy development, and it wasn't ready to be consulted on, and certainly not the detail at that stage, although there were some consultations. But an integrated food chain is something we all want to work towards. We did some work, not least because of the risks around EU exit, to look at the amount of food we import into the country. And you know, a lot of what we import, well, we couldn't produce here. So the obvious thing is some more exotic fruit and vegetables. But a lot of what we import is also ingredients for our food manufacturing industry in Wales. And some of those ingredients, it's quite shocking. You know, things like chicken breasts, things like onions, things like garlic, things that we could produce in this country, we could produce more of, but we don't. And we have to ask the question, why don't we? And there is an opportunity there, but we need to get buy-in from the whole of the food chain. So that's producers, manufacturers and retailers, so that there is enough confidence. So if I'm a landowner and I'm going to supply a local food factory with onions, I need to have some degree of guarantee or assurance that they will buy my onions. So even if they're not all perfectly sized and shaped and everything else, that they will still buy them and they won't leave me with a crop that I can't sell. So there's a big trust and confidence challenge to overcome. But integration is certainly important. Local supply chains, certainly an important part of the landscape when it comes to food supply, but it's not the solution. And I think someone made the point that if we look at what if we got 3 million people in Wales, if all 3 million people bought everything from local supply chains, we would still have far too much food production. So, you know, we export 40% of our lamb, for example, unless we start producing a lot of that lamb, but we will still have to export it. The local supply chains help, but the point was also made that buying locally can be more expensive. And a lot of people, I mean, successive UK governments over very, very many years have always supported a cheap food policy. And that's why we've become so dependent on so much imported food. But that's something which seems to be what consumers in the main want. They want cheap food. And our food is very cheap by other country comparisons. So, you know, if as a population we can accept some increase in food prices, well, then there's more scope to supply more locally. But the supermarkets will be here for the long term and will continue to supply most of the food. We did see during the COVID crisis that local supply chains really gained momentum, and some of them newly established, and a number of them seem to be doing well now that the worst of that part of the crisis perhaps has passed. But we're also seeing that there has been a move back to more conventional shopping in supermarkets by a lot of people. And the move to online does seem to be sustainable. There was a big shift to online shopping, and that is sustainable. But local and direct to consumer will continue, and continue to grow, hopefully. And then finally, just the point about public procurement. I mean, public procurement is very regularly raised when it comes to food supply chains and sustainability of supply chains and the likes. And again, it's part of it. But like everything, it's very, very difficult. And when public sector food procurement was the responsibility of the National Procurement Service and the food category within, to try to persuade, take for example a health board, to procure food differently can be very, very difficult. Often they have very long-standing relationships with their provider. Often they want, surprise, surprise, they want it to be easy for them. So if they need to source huge quantities of whatever, it's much easier for them to go to one of the major food suppliers than to start to disaggregate those procurement contracts and tenders. Even though they can understand that that might be a much better thing to do in terms of local food production and the likes, but it can be very difficult. It's also budget. You know, all of these things are controlled by budget, and health boards and food procurement budgets and all the rest are never as generous, if you like, as they need to be. So they're trying to balance all of these things together. And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't look at improving these situations, but I just want to highlight that it's much more difficult than people often realize when they say, well, let's just procure all Welsh food for supply chains. And sorry, I've spoken for much too long, but thank you for that opportunity.
That's very kind of you. Thank you, David. Just a couple of supplementary points, really. I think you talked about training and skills. So I wonder what plans Welsh Government have around training and skills. It seems to be a critical issue. We can talk about subsidies, but also, as you say, there's a skills gap. So what are Welsh Government planning to do around that? And you talked about how important local supply chain integration would be. So again, what plans do Welsh Government have around encouraging local supply chain integration? Sorry, tongue-tied there. You talked about cheap food, but cheap food comes at a cost, and at the moment we're seeing that cost in a degraded environment. So I wonder what your thoughts are around that and this balance between cheap food at the cost of despoiling our environment and pushing up climate change. So I wonder again on that. And around the NHS local procurement thing, it seems to me that the budgets are in the gift of policymakers to set. I appreciate the issue around complexity, but again, from experience elsewhere in the UK, where local authorities are given the target of sourcing a particular amount of product locally, then surprisingly they do manage to do that. So again, I just sense that I think, you know, there's a direction of travel, and whilst we wouldn't expect Welsh Government to turn around and say you've got to source everything locally, a percentage sourced locally would certainly be a step in the right direction. So I just wonder what your thoughts are on those points.
Okay, I'll just come back briefly because I don't want to
hold the limelight. Appreciate that. Thank you. Sorry.
In terms of skills, there's an awful lot actually happening on skills development. I mean, if you take it at the knowledge transfer level, the Farming Connect initiative has been long established and continues to go from strength to strength. And my understanding is similar will carry on post sustainable farming on our land and the new approach of something for something and public goods delivery. Via the food and drink industry clusters, which are primarily food manufacturing level, there's lots of knowledge transfer and training provided there as well. We have things like Food Skills Cymru, which has been up and running now for the last couple of years, which again is providing a whole range of skills and training to the different subsectors within food, including horticulture. So there's lots there. We have industry skills partnerships, which are grassroots level, business driven initiatives in terms of the skills that are needed in different sectors. And but we're constantly reviewing our skills provision with the ambition of making it even better. So there's a lot happening, and we're always open to approaches and proposals from stakeholders as well as to where there are gaps and how they might be filled. In terms of local supply chain integration and what we are doing, again, I would come back to things like our food business clusters, and we're doing a lot of work at the moment around our brand, our food brand in Wales, our sustainable brand values, what that means in effect. And we have a stakeholder group which has been guiding us in that work. And they're very, very keen that whenever we do should feature Welsh provenance strongly in the brand. So, you know, and if we take the legal definition of that, it needs to be 50% or more Welsh ingredients in a product for it to be actually described as a Welsh product. And that's something we're completely in agreement with, and that's something we want to champion, and that's something we want to build on. And part of that is also persuading, convincing food manufacturers that there is merit in sourcing more Welsh ingredients and being able to brand their products as truly Welsh. And some of that is around about the price mark, the price premium we will get from doing that. But some of that is also about the whole corporate social responsibility policies of those businesses in terms of supporting local communities, local producers, local food production. And you mentioned about environmental degradation and cheap food and the likes. Well, of course, the whole ethos behind sustainable farming on our land is to reverse that environmental degradation if we think that's already happened. So that is why food production will still be extremely important in respect of the new policy, but it must be done absolutely in harmony, in sympathy with the environmental outcomes. And it won't be a case of area payments anymore just for being there, just for producing food or whenever, or holding on to animals. It'll be subsidies for producing public good outcomes, environmental outcomes, not entirely environmental outcomes, but that'll be a big part of it. So any degradation that's there, hopefully, we will see an improvement. And then the whole public procurement thing again, budgets are important, you know, and budgets are tight, and budgets are tighter than ever now post-COVID. And you know, EU exit presents further challenges. So we can't get away from the fact that if whether it's a local health authority or whatever, if they haven't got the money to put in place what is going to be maybe administratively a more costly, a more resource intensive tendering process, and then to manage that procurement afterwards, they're going to be very reluctant to do it. So it's not all about money, but money is important in that. When it comes to legislating, you get into difficult territory there. And I think one of the speakers said earlier, in France, there is legislation that requires supermarkets, for example, to sell or to stock so much local produce. Now, in the UK, those powers are reserved, so that's a UK government decision. So the Welsh government couldn't make that legislation anyway. But then you get into issues around competition and everything else. And it's, obviously they've done it in France. Potentially it could be done at a UK government level, but it's not something that the UK government is inclined towards at all at this point in time. Having said that, our supermarkets and almost all of them have an interest in local and regional produce. They have an interest in Welsh produce, and some of them have done a lot to champion Welsh products and have huge numbers of SKUs that are Welsh SKUs. That's been squeezed again because of COVID and pressures on household budgets and pressures on the economy generally. So it's not going to be an easy time to get more Welsh products onto supermarket shelves. But there's still opportunity, and that's something we work very hard at in terms of our direct engagement with retailers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'd also, again, like to thank you for taking the time to come on the conference and to give your opinion. It's really, really appreciated. Thank you very much. Just very quickly, and I'm conscious of the time, we did start a bit late, but I'm just going to be very unfair now. I'm going to ask each of the panelists, given that Dave is here, give me one thing that they would want Welsh Government to do in terms of helping us achieve this synergy model that we've been talking about this morning. So very quickly, I'll start with Chris. What are your thoughts, Chris?
Okay, I'm going to repeat what I suppose I said before. What I'd like the Welsh Government to look at, it may not be within their powers, but maybe we should do this. I'm fundamentally worried about the cost of economics of cost advantages of scale, and unless we address that, I don't think we're going to we're not going to make the scale of the change. It'll just become a virtue signaling for the middle class, organic vegetables. It needs to be across everything. I think I would like to see us looking at, in conjunction with other subsidies, some small scale production subsidy, which would enable the investment in small scale production and small scale and local distribution. And I've reached the conclusion that we're not going to make the scale of change that we need. It's going to need quite a creative thought process, because it's not necessarily within our powers. There are ways of doing it, but if we don't address the economics, I don't think we're going to make the scale of change quick enough, large enough, or quickly enough for the ecological and community disasters that we've got coming for us.
Great, thank you, Chris. Emily, you're on mute again, Emily.
Is that better? Okay, I'm going to not completely answer your question. Sorry about that. Because I'll tell you why. This is a little bit of a devil's advocate, but I would suggest that we're all looking to a very large body, the government, to give us solutions and to bail us out. And I know that there is a level of support that's required, but I think the government system at the minute is not functioning as it should to get the money where it needs. And I'll give you one example of that, and this is our project to plant up completely unusable common land. I won't go into that in detail, but last year the Welsh government declared climate emergency, and at the same time they achieved 4% of their tree planting targets in Wales, even though there was still money in the pot and there were still farmers wanting to put trees in the ground. The system in place to get to the money that was assigned for that purpose was too complicated for farmers to get hold of it. The will is there, and I think there are great people who want to do great things in government, but I think it's too complicated. It's not getting where it needs. So I think we have a responsibility as farmers and community people to set up projects that work outside of government. And I think once we provide these models, I think the government funding will come, but we have to stop waiting for all the answers to come from government. That's all I've got to say about that.
Thank you. I mean, that wasn't quite my intention, was to suggest that the Welsh government should come up with all the answers. I just wanted an opportunity to ask for one thing from Welsh government.
I wouldn't know what to ask for, because I just think it's too difficult to get the money.
Well, maybe that's
in my experience.
Maybe that's the thing we should be asking, to make this money more easily accessible.
There we go. So I wasn't being confrontational. I just thought I'd be a devil's advocate.
That's fine. Holly, what are your thoughts, quickly?
Right. Well, there's so many, so I'm struggling to choose which one. I'd say see our response to sustainable farming in our land for all of them. As this session is about silos versus synergies. So I've been working with representatives from other parts of the food chain, so including livestock farmers, the food environmental organisations, and food poverty, and sorry, would you be able to mute?
Sorry,
as there's a background noise.
Sorry, I'll go there.
Okay, so been working with a cross sector from different parts of the food system, looking at health, poverty, environmental sustainability, and farming. And one of the asks that we as a coalition, calling ourselves the Food Policy Alliance Cymru, are asking for the next Welsh government, so after the next elections, is to set up a commission that would have representatives from across the food sector to look at how to create a holistic food system that's fit for future generations. So this would look at addressing food poverty, at looking at food for public health and increasing horticulture, look at how to get a net zero food system and farming for nature, as well as ensuring livelihoods. Because so the ask is to have this commission, and for that to be to have people not just from government but from across the sector, because I think Em's right, we can't leave it all to government. But Chris is also right. If we don't have the economics in place, nothing, things aren't going to change. So we need to have that broad bit of expertise looking at a holistic system.
Excellent. That sounds yes, a commission sounds an ideal way forward on a lot of these issues. And again, linking government and farming sector and food and farming, health, the whole thing. So yeah. Dafydd, would you like to give us your thoughts? One last thought on what you would want if you had a magic wand and ask the Welsh government, what would you want?
There are two thoughts. One of them is to remove the barriers that Welsh government has it within their gift to remove. A lot of those barriers are around an obsession with understocking the uplands. It is one of my real bugbears. We've seen massive environmental declines as a result of the fact that we're not grazing our uplands enough in some places, and we're overgrazing marginal land in others. As a result of that, the pressure's just got wrong. So the barriers around the way that agri-environment schemes work in terms of just how prescriptive they are, the barriers around the way that Welsh government's policies, realistically, things like the woodland creation grant and the Welsh woodland mapping tools that don't allow for the planting of woodlands in areas that realistically are very poor habitats as they stand, would be far better as woodlands, would free up land somewhere else, that don't allow us to move our livestock. Regulation around TB as well, which stops us stocking our uplands with cattle. Really simple stuff that's within Welsh government's gift. Take away those barriers, and suddenly you end up with a considerably more nimble agricultural sector, which is capable of responding and of being far more responsive. Because at the moment, it does feel a little bit like the restrictions placed by the subsidy regime that we're in realistically mean that the government is the sole farmer of most of Wales. And we need to move away from that towards a point where farmers are able to take far more decisions on their own land. The other point is, in reality, cheap food isn't a choice. People don't choose to go for cheap food. In the UK, we have far higher rental prices than anywhere else. Our property prices are exceptionally high. The cost of living in terms of people's bank accounts is sky high in the UK. You make food more expensive, you're going to make people poor. So the reality is we need foundational support in the agricultural sector unless you're going to deflate property value or unless you're going to take money out of somebody's pension pot. And we need that level of foundational support, and we need to move away from what will be another barrier, which is an obsession with paying purely for environmental outcomes or some very narrow definition of public goods. We need foundational support in the industry that will encourage small-scale production. It doesn't need to be a large amount of foundational support, but it does need to be there. And it needs to be there potentially in perpetuity, because as long as property prices remain high, as long as we end up in a situation where we have lots of people entering poverty every year, the industry isn't going to suddenly become viable without subsidies. We need to realise that it's a choice, and it's a choice in the long term. That's it.
Excellent. Thank you, Dafydd. Well, that's brilliant. That's an excellent finish to the session. I'd like to, I don't know how we do this in COVID world, but I would like to thank all of our panelists for their comments this morning. I think it's been a really, really useful session. And again, I'd like to thank Dave Morris for attending on behalf of Welsh Government and giving his thoughts. So if you would all like to show your appreciation in the normal way and thank everybody for taking part. Thank you very much.